From Social Prosperity Partners, this is Community Catalysts. Welcome to Community Catalysts, the podcast that examines the qualities of community leadership and the many paths and forms it can take. I'm your host, Matt Lehrman. Today, our guest is Mayor Joe LaRussa of Farmington, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. It's a city with a population of just over 10,000 people, known for its historic downtown, strong sense of community, and focus on sustainability. Farmington is a model for small cities striving to balance modern growth with preserving its rich heritage. Under Mayor LaRussa's leadership, the city has prioritized economic development, infrastructure improvement, and environmental initiatives to create a more livable, walkable community. Mayor Joe LaRussa, it's great to meet you and welcome to Community Catalysts.
It's so great to be here, Matt. Thanks for having me.
So, Mayor, you decided to run for city council in 2017 because you felt that the neighborhood in which you lived had been left behind, despite the city being rather small. So take us back to the dawning of the idea that you would even run for office. Who were you then, and how did it happen that you decided to run for office in the first place?
Well, that's a great question to lead off with because it's a story that I tell pretty often. You know, I was a young father at the time. We'd moved into a neighborhood that when we moved in, there was a school about 2 blocks from the house. And at the time, the school district was downsizing. We didn't realize that when we purchased our home, but it turns out the school building in our neighborhood was targeted for reduction or removal. At that time, the school district sold the property to a developer. The developer did something really nice, and instead of maximizing their build out, they donated a portion of the land back to the city to use as a community park. Unfortunately, that park, the assets, when they were put back in, extracted and then put back in, it didn't really work out very well because the equipment on extraction was damaged and wasn't able to pass required safety inspections for reinstallation. So the number of assets were reduced and there really wasn't a lot to do in the park. So I would take my children there, and one day I took them and they asked me to take them somewhere else. And I stood there in that moment and said, this isn't right. I have skills. I know how to find resources. I know how to organize. We're going to get something in this park, because the next closest place for me to take my kids to recreate was going to require me to cross a 4-lane county road. You know, it wasn't very pedestrian friendly. I certainly wouldn't let them ride their bikes or walk on their own. So I felt the best solution was to go and get this park, you know, some help.
I'm sorry, you're saying that the swings and the slide and all of that it wasn't good.
It was pretty sad. Yeah, the only equipment that was reinstalled were swings and 1 single slide and 2 tire swings on top of the normal swing sets, and that was about it. There was a walking path, wasn't paved, not a lot to do there. Even if you brought your own frisbee or ball, it wasn't the coolest place to be, especially when you come from a school playground or something that's got jungle gyms and a lot of other things. You know, my kids were used to a much more well-appointed, let's call it, space at their school.
Yeah, and to be clear, you weren't on the city council yet, right? You were not already a community activist in some way. You were just a dad?
Yeah, just a dad. I had done a short stint in the Downtown Development Authority's design committee. I'm a registered professional engineer. So myself and a couple of other professionals, architects, things like that, we had participated in some committee work, but never in elected office.
Interesting. Okay, so finish the story here. So
went to City Hall, got a nice, pat on the shoulder. Thanks for your concern. We'll look into that. And time passed and I got fed up with being fed up and I put my name on the ballot, got elected. I was the 3rd place finisher, which in Farmington won me a 2-year seat. But that was plenty of time because 2 years after I got elected, we had a playscape in that park. On top of that, once we got that first asset installed, we saw a lot of momentum build around that. So, we should put a bike rack there. Oh, we should pave the walking path. Oh, we should remulch the whole playground. You know, it was just, once we got that community energy flowing, it generated a lot of positive momentum. And now that park is very well appointed and we're still talking about what else we can do there. The community's talking about that. So for me as an elected leader now, it's really nice that the community has taken that ownership and sees that park as theirs, and they constantly come with more ideas and ways for us to make it better.
I get the part of the story where you saw a problem and you weren't satisfied with how the city was addressing it, and you dived in to fix it, and as a result, you run for office. But I want to ask you to go back to the actual moment of decision making when you sat with your spouse, when it first dawned on you, I could just run for office. Like, what was happening in that moment? And did anyone say to you, you're crazy to do that? Or why would you take time away from your work, from your family? Like, what was happening in the moment of actually dawning of the idea that you might run for council?
Well, you might be entertained by the response that I actually got when I brought the discussion to the dinner table. My wife looked me in the face and deadpan said to me, "I'm surprised it took this long. Go for it." So it was something that I had dabbled with elected office in college. I was the longest serving senator from the College of Engineering at the University of Michigan Dearborn, which is not a very difficult office to win and hold because there aren't very many engineering students that want to run for student government. So it wasn't the most difficult position to obtain or hold. But having served in a capacity where I was responsible in part for the shepherding of community resources, like at a college campus, it struck a chord with me. And even now, I think back to those days of how I learned to work with other people, find consensus, build coalitions to work toward priorities that benefit the community. And that was something I learned very early in my college education.
That's terrific. So let's talk about some of the lessons that you learned early. You mentioned to me that early in your leadership journey, you learned something about swimming upstream and that it's only sustainable in short bursts. Tell me what that means and what was the story behind that? How did you learn that lesson?
Yeah, so being a leader sometimes requires you to maybe turn against the currents. I like to say it's like you can float along the lazy river of what's easy and the way that things are kind of moving, you can flow with it, or you could choose to swim against it for a specific purpose or reason. However, anybody that's done any sort of swimming in a current knows that there's only so long you can do that before you exhaust yourself and the current then sweeps you away. So if you're going to make a deliberate move to swim against the current, you have to know going in that you have a limited amount of energy that you can spend on that task. And once it's consumed, the current is going to sweep you away. So you either need to get back into the flow or you need to get out of that current in order for it not to sweep you away. And the story there have been other priorities in my leadership experience. My journey, spans a lot of different sectors. So in the marketplace, in business, as an engineer in the automotive industry, in nonprofit, serving on boards, and now serving as an elected official, there have been a number of occasions where there was something that was super important to me and that I felt was relevant for our constituents or customers. And I would swim against that current hard, advocating, doing what was necessary. But at a certain point, I didn't realize that I was going to exhaust myself and the current was just too strong to get things done. And to swim against that current, you need a motor that can drive you upstream to get to the goal.
Mayor, I don't want to ask anything that's, proprietary information to the engineering in the automobile industry, but can you actually tell us, what was the kind of change you were trying to make and, how come that was so difficult to do? Can you tell us the specifics of that?
Yeah, sure. So the one, I'll tell you one story. I was process responsible. The engine manufacturing engineers generally are responsible for the machinery and equipment that make things, the widgets. So this one machine that I was working on, or that I was responsible for, I saw an opportunity to reduce the amount of time it took to change over between products that we had to make. But let's just say that the more senior people were advising me that, hey, if it's a running system and it works, maybe you don't want to touch that. But I saw the opportunity, right? I saw this opportunity to reduce the number of minutes we were spending changing over and spending more minutes making more widgets. So I really wanted to tackle this. So I grabbed onto that project, and for a while it seemed pretty like I had really good support. Maintenance was on board. I had the production teams that actually ran the machine were like, yeah, that'd be great. If we didn't have to spend time swapping things out and doing all this would be great. There seemed to be a lot of buy-in. Well, then when we got into the nuts and bolts of what we had to actually change on the machine, it got a little complicated. That complexity started to introduce fear or uncertainty for some people who previously supported it And now that fear or uncertainty was giving them a little bit of pause. Like, do we really want to do this? Are we sure we want to do this? And I just kept swimming. I'm like, come on, we can do it. We can do it. You know, the motivator, right? We're smart enough to do this. We can make this happen. And eventually we got to the point where we had to implement and actually take the machine down to make the change. We went for it and the machine didn't come back up right away. And now it's, oh no, were all these people right? Maybe I should, right? The doubt starts to creep into to my own heart and mind, where it's like,
this is Murphy's Law, right? If you play with a thing long enough, you will surely break it.
That's right. Were they right? I can't believe this. This doesn't make sense. Well, it turned out, I gathered myself. I went back into the software. It was not just hardware. It was a software change because we had to tell the machine now to do something different. And that's a software change. So this was simply a software bug, and it did resolve and we did get the change implemented. But there was that moment where swimming upstream and being the advocate and being the person to say, we should change this. We could make it better. That was a moment in time where I learned, if I had continued to swim upstream, I probably would have exhausted myself, but I spent the energy appropriately and we did have a positive outcome. We were able to get an extra 30 minutes a shift, making more widgets. And that was a productivity increase that the plant actually booked and put on, all their reports. It was a great thing. But this was early in my career, but it was a very sticky lesson. It stuck with me for a long time.
It's informed your whole approach to change management.
Yes.
Mayor, let's go backwards in our conversation a bit. Go back to the park for a second. Residents don't like to get involved in municipal affairs unless there is something to complain about. And so you went and complained, and I gather you got other residents, to agree with you and to register complaints. How did you go about turning that into a situation of neighbors working together to make the situation better? How did you turn that into a positive community building experience?
Well, that's a good story, actually. The first step was validating my own assessment, right? It's one thing for one person to say, I'm upset about this, or I don't like this or that topic. So the first thing was, is there support for something like this in the neighborhood? And absolutely, there are plenty of young families that live in the neighborhood that I live in. And they also were like, yeah, you know what? It's a pretty sad looking park. We could probably do better than that. So the first step was getting some validation that my point of view was not one that I held alone. The next step was really explaining to the neighbors how the process works. Being an engineer, being process oriented, that was a very frequent response I got. Well, we should go and tell the city council that we want our tax money spent on recreational assets in the park. And I said, that is absolutely something we can do. In Farmington, it's a 5-member council. I'm one of 5. I will fight for every dollar. I said, and going back to the statement about stepping back and looking at this from multiple perspectives, I said, so what's my answer when my colleagues will rightfully ask me, well, why that park and not this park over here? Why should we do, if we do this for that park, what about the next neighborhood that comes around the corner and wants, us to prioritize resources for some neighborhood project in their neighborhood? And then everybody kind of said, well, yeah, but I pay taxes. And I said, listen, here's how it's going to go. Here's how the movie ends. If you want me to go and fight for it, I'll fight for it. You're going to get what you get, and you're going to get it when my colleagues and I decide you're going to get it. How old are your kids? Oh, my kids are, right, fill in the blank, 8 years old and 5 years old. Oh, okay. Well, how long are you willing to wait? If you want it now, while your children can enjoy it, and you want what you want, we have to come with more than I pay taxes. That led to a door-to-door campaign in the neighborhood. So me and about 4 other like-minded individuals who were willing to lead the initiative went door-to-door in a neighborhood of about 400 households, explained that we were raising money for this park, for this playscape. And then we went to a city council meeting, and about 25 families came to the meeting before our budget was going to be presented, and presented a $15,000 check to the city. And 25 families during public comment said, please support this playscape. It's very important. This is something that would really brighten our neighborhood. It would improve our property values. It's good for the city. This would be a really good thing. We really hope you'll support it. And then at the budget meeting, that playscape was in the budget and unanimously supported by my colleagues on the council.
You and the neighbors presented a $15,000 check to the city council?
Yep.
What was that moment like? Was that incredible?
It was a pretty emotional moment, and it was amplified because the families that came to the council meeting to actually make public comment, the parents obviously were, very passionate about asking for this. But when I saw children coming up to the microphone with their pieces of paper and unfolding it and saying, I really hope you can make this happen. It would be really great to be able to walk to the park near my house and play. The park isn't that great right now. This would really be a nice thing. Please support the park. So it got a little bit emotional because, it meant so much to me to see those children so happy and giving the credit to their parents who not only showed up at a meeting to make comment, but wrote checks to make it happen for their kids. And that's the kind of community bonding or glue. You just don't find that everywhere, number one. And number two, it's hard to activate it when you do find it. But to find this thing that everybody could unite around, it was really an emotional moment when the yes votes were counted.
Is that something that you can tap into only as a member of the community, as an activist and an organizer, or once you got onto council and once you were appointed to be mayor, right, by your council? So
yes.
Once you were in elected office, could you still rally that same kind of support, or is that kind of support come from the grassroots to be authentic?
I mean, it depends on the situation and the priority set. I would encourage any elected official to do some of that organizing. Number one, because you're an elected official, you're going to be able to engage more community members. They will show up to talk to their council member or their mayor or their administration, their city manager. And it doesn't always have to be an elected official. It might be getting the right member of the administration into the neighborhood to talk about, hey, we want to organize tree trimming in the neighborhood because we know it's a huge amount of work to run around and maintain all these trees. So we use the community members as a force multiplier for administration resources that can't possibly be everywhere all the time, right? So it really is it's a two-way street. As an elected official or as a member of the administration, you have intrinsic authority to convene, to engage, to talk to people. But certainly for things that are maybe flying under the radar, as an elected official, our attention is always on the entirety, right? I can focus on my neighborhood, or I can zoom out and say, what's best for the city. So sometimes you need those organizers in the individual neighborhoods to draw attention to those neighborhood specific things. Because as an elected official, your focus shifts away from maybe your block or your neighborhood, and you have to take into account the entirety of the city when you're making your decisions.
Let me ask you to reflect on something. I just published a podcast episode with the mayor of Nevada City, California, a city of about 3,000 people. It lives with an incredible fire danger because it's located at the top of a valley. And if there's fire in the valley, it's going to come straight up to them, the smoke and on all of that. And the mayor talked about creating not just an audit of all the 1,100 homes that were there, or the fire protection, what they had, but also creating a neighbor-to-neighbor connection program so that neighbors knew who was disabled, who was infirm, who didn't have transportation, who was ill or whatever, so that they could help each other. Because in a moment of crisis, there's only so much that the city and the first responders can do. There has to be kind of an agility built into the response with neighbors looking out for each other. It kind of sounds like it's a different environment, entirely, but that same kind of neighbor-to-neighbor connection is really meaningful to you.
It is, and that was some of the unintended benefits of doing these community projects. We live in a world now where people are more isolated than ever before. I heard a challenge from a professor from Missouri that said, do you know who's behind the 8 doors that surround your house? We have 8 houses surrounding our door. Do we know who's behind those 8 doors? And, in that context, building connective tissue in a community is vital, not only for emergency preparedness, which is the case you're describing, but to have a social engagement, to have a block party, to have name it. I mean, building that connective tissue is even more important in today's day and age than it ever has been, because it's not as organic as it used to be, because we have so many other ways we could spend our time and our attention and our energy. And so, yes, emergency preparedness is something that certainly you can get a group of people around, but these other topics as well, that also stitch together that community fabric is vitally important. And I treasure that about Farmington, honestly.
How do we inspire people to take more of that kind of initiative in their own neighborhoods?
That's a huge question. And it's one that a lot of municipal leaders are wrestling with, because in the midst of all of the day-to-day governing that has to happen just to keep things going as they are, community engagement is really, it's a topic that is necessary to pay some attention to, but I would say is maybe the least structured. And that's for good reason. The best case scenario is when you can create an opportunity for it to happen organically. And municipalities can do that by having policies that make it easy for people to get together and do things, whether it's hosting a special event, whether it's getting a permit for street closure, whether it's, you could probably make a bigger list than me from all the folks you've talked to that are having great ideas. That's one thing we can do from a policy perspective, is make the rule book thin and easy and automate as much of that as possible. Technology does bring benefits, and being able to automate the workflows, let's say, to get those engagements and make them easy. If you tell somebody, yes, you can have a block party, but you have to fill out this form and it's not available online. You have to come to City Hall. You have to fill it out. You have to come write a check. It has to be reviewed by 3 layers of people. And if they all say yes, then we will confirm your date. And this process will take about 4 weeks. That is not the universe we live in, where people can click once and an item shows up on their doorstep, in some cases the same day. People are conditioned for immediate response, fast feedback. That's what residents expect. And I feel like municipalities, that's one place where we could really move the needle, is taking some of those best practices that we see in the private sector and implementing them to generate more connective tissue in our community. And I think that's that's like the base hit. The home run is tapping people and not being afraid to ask for help. There are plenty of initiatives or policy discussions that we have that it would be super useful to have feedback from the community, from constituents, or from groups of people that already gather for whatever reason, right? If we're going to do renovation to our parks, maybe I want to talk to the youth baseball people. Maybe I want to talk to the CrossFitters that own businesses in the community, yoga studios. Hey, if we were going to do some renovation in this park, what assets do you want to see there so that you can host outdoor yoga instead of having everybody put their mats on the grass? Would you do it different if we had the opportunity? What would you want? And I feel like sometimes there's a apprehension or a straight up aversion to going and asking for that feedback, because we're elected officials. We're supposed to know it all, right? We are the representatives of the people. We're supposed to know everything. And I feel like sometimes it can be perceived as weakness when you want to get that feedback. But honestly, it makes you a stronger public servant when you have the feedback directly from the people.
Mayor, as we were preparing for our conversation and going back and forth with some email, you mentioned having a passion for a project that you called Leadership in the Home. And I wonder if I could ask you to explain what you mean by that and help me understand how you distinguish between leading in one's household and leadership roles in the public and private sector.
Yeah, that is a very high passion area for me, because as I've grown as a leader, I came to a realization as I was commuting home every day to and from work. I was commuting home one day and it dawned on me because, you have stressors at home, just like you have stressors at work. At work, you're dealing with issues with people, budget, time. And then you come home and you say to yourself, man, we have to deal with some things in here, budgets and time and issues with people. The difference is we're highly trained to deal with those things in the marketplace. I know leaders who will pore over spreadsheets for hours, looking to squeeze 5% out of their budget or to find resources to enable something they want to do, but they can't generate additional revenue. It has to come from what they have. And then we come home and we take all that training and skill off like a jacket at the end of the day, and we hang it up and we don't think past Saturday. At work, we're taught to think ahead, think 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out. So I started applying some of these tools in my household. I looked at my children and I said, you know what? I've got about 15 summers with them because the first 3, they're not going to remember. And the last couple, they're probably going to want to spend it with friends. So I've got maybe 15 summers that I can make something memorable with my children. What do I want to do with that time? I have the privilege of allocating that time, just like I have the privilege of allocating time at work of myself and the people who I'm responsible for. I can allocate that scarce resource. What's the framework that I'm going to use to allocate that resource? How do I want to spend that time? Do I want to spend it just with us as a nuclear family unit? Do I want to spend some of it with people with extended family who we don't see very often? Do I want to allocate some of that scarce resource spending time with people outside our family whose friendship we value and treasure? And, that's a skill we hone very sharp in the marketplace. But then we come home and we don't think that way. It's, who's coming over? Right? It's almost like it's a bother or a burden instead of seeing it as something of value. So I see leadership in the home as something that is lagging or trailing leadership in the marketplace or leadership at City Hall. There are places where leadership has a very tangible definition or goal. And yet in the household, the statistics speak for themselves. 50% of marriages end up in divorce. The average American household can't take a $400 emergency expense without going into debt. Household debt levels are, very high. If you looked at a balance sheet in your workplace and said, we've got a lot of debt here, we should do something about that because our balance sheet is really weak and we're susceptible to disturbances in the market. All the things you would analyze at work. Well, you have a balance sheet in your household and you have a P&L statement in your household. Why not take those same skills and deploy them in your household? How much better off would our town, our state, our country be if the skills we deployed in other spheres were applied to our household in terms of leadership development? I'm raising future leaders. The time and the energy and the knowledge and things that I put into their brains are getting them ready for when it's going to be their turn. Because my time is limited. All of our time is limited. My time is going to pass, and then it's going to be their time. And are they ready? And at work, we struggle with that, right? We sit there at work. Oh my gosh, if so-and-so left tomorrow, won the lottery tomorrow, how would we manage? How would we get by? That we don't have a backup for this critical position, succession planning. We do all these structured activities to analyze weaknesses in our organization. And yet we come home and it's just like, well, whatever comes, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
I love your passion for this, but if there was any doubt that you were an engineer, you've erased it completely because you've basically applied all your engineering principles everywhere. And Now I need to ask your wife at some point whether you're actually living the, don't swim against the stream, or whether that really works in your personal life as well. But I love the strategy and the thought that you put into it. Mayor, we're at the part of our conversation where I'd like to ask you a bunch of lightning round questions, some questions that I will challenge you to answer in just one sentence or less. You ready?
Shoot.
Mayor Joe LaRussa, describe your leadership style in just 3 words.
Tough but fair.
In the movie version of your life, who plays you?
Probably Tom Cruise.
And what's the best leadership advice you've ever received?
Be persistent.
What's a must-do experience in Farmington for first-time visitors?
A first-time visitor should 100% spend time in downtown Farmington and walk our streets and do it during the Grand Raven Festival in October.
Mayor, if you could instantly gain one new skill, what would it be?
Flying an airplane.
Here's a question that's perfect for an engineer. What's one small change in the process of local government that could make a big difference in your community?
Automating standard work.
What would you say to yourself in a message sent back in time to be opened just before being elected to council for the first time in 2017? What would you tell yourself?
Enjoy the ride.
Mayor, if you could spend 1 hour in a one-on-one conversation with any leader, past or present, who would you choose and what question would you ask them?
I would probably ask Abraham Lincoln how much sleep he gets, because that is a leader who dealt with probably some of the most complex issues and did not have the benefit of the internet and all of the communication and all of the tools that we have available. I can only imagine how the communication systems of the day and the inherent lag in the arrival of information, I can't even imagine waiting, longing for feedback and not being able to get it, having to wait for it. I would lose sleep in that scenario.
The burden that he must have kept on his shoulders to hold the nation together. Last question, Mayor. We live in divisive and challenging times. What makes you optimistic for the future of your community?
The biggest thing that makes me optimistic about my community is that when people talk to each other, all of that divisiveness and all of that stuff that we experience, at a macro level just dissolves away. Because when you're talking to people about people's stuff, everybody can find a way to relate to one another. It's when we artificially sort ourselves into these camps and us's and them's, that's where it gets prickly. But I think, I'm optimistic because every person I talk to, and I've had that happen, I'll talk to somebody and they will say, I am so glad we had this conversation. I never knew, or I never thought. So that's what keeps me optimistic.
Mayor Joe LaRussa, thank you for being open to this conversation. It's really been wonderful talking to you.
Matt, thank you so much for the time. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate you giving me the chance to talk about Farmington here.
Thanks so much. Once again, my thanks to Mayor Joe LaRussa of Farmington, Michigan. This episode was edited by Nick Living the Dream Tantillo. Our executive producer is John Little. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. Ask me a question, share a comment, or let me know that you have a story to share. You can reach me at 602-688-2724 or matt@socialprosperity.us. I'd love to hear from you. We'll be back soon with another Community Catalyst.